All right. I could go ahead and start. Okay, yeah, if anybody comes in late, just everybody glare at them. How come you're not on time? Okay, so my name is Tim DeForest. I work at the library at the Ringling College of Art, a little bit north of here. North, right? Yes. And I'm here today to talk about something I'm a little bit of a scholar on, which is the history of the American comic strip and comic book. And I do kind of a version of this talk for elementary school this time, so we can find out if you guys are as smart as a fifth grader. Okay, if we go back to 1896, before there was internet, before there was radio, before there was TV, how did people get their news? Radio. No, before radio.
Newspaper.
Yeah, newspaper. So that was the main source of news. Nowadays, newspapers are becoming less and less of a part of our culture. And there's all sorts of questions about whether they'll survive and if it's a printed media and all of that. But in 1895, they were how you got your news. And so naturally, there was a lot of competition. Even small towns would often have several newspapers. Big cities like New York would literally have dozens of papers. They'd have morning papers, they'd have afternoon papers, they'd have evening papers. And so there was a lot of competition. If I had a newspaper, I would want people to buy mine, not yours. So newspaper publishers were always looking for ways to increase their circulation. And what we have here is William Randolph Hearst, who owned a lot of newspapers. His flagship paper was the New York Journal. And his arch enemy, Joseph Pulitzer, whose flagship paper was the New York World. So these two guys, important newspaper guys in the country, and they always wanted to beat the other in sales. So in 1895, Pulitzer, on the right there, acquired one of the first color printers. So now he could publish stuff in color, and this was a brand new thing. And one of the things he did with it was to publish what would be the first modern comic strip. It was called The Yellow Kid, and it was written and drawn by a guy named R.F. Outcault, and it was enormously popular. Now, the idea of a comic strip had been around for about a century. In Europe, in the early 19th century, there was an artist named Rudolf Topfer, who many people consider the first comic book artist. So the idea of using graphic images to tell a story, a little story, had been around. But The Yellow Kid was the first time people were seeing it in color, and it was the same character every week. So you knew this character, you cared about him, the way we all care about the fictional characters that we enjoy reading about. His name was Mickey Hogan. When I was growing up and I was first learning about old comics, I thought he was supposed to be Chinese. But, but no, he's Irish. And he lives in an Irish neighborhood called Hogan's Alley. And the gags, in this one, for instance, he's hiding behind the corner to give the little girl a scare, and he doesn't realize that there's a dog there that's chewing the behind of his pants off. So that was that. Now this was so popular that William Randolph Hearst hired the artist Outcault away to go to the Journal and do The Yellow Kid there, which caused Pulitzer to sue him. And in a court decision that I have never fully understood, but I'm not a copyright expert, but it's just weird, the court said they could each do their own version of the strip as long as they gave it different titles. So the New York Journal kept doing The Yellow Kid with Outcault. The World got another artist to do the same character and called it Hogan's Alley. Now this was successful, so pretty soon newspapers had a Sunday comic book page. And another early important artist was Rudolph Dirks, who did a strip called The Katzenjammer Kids. And these were about a German immigrant family. And we read it today, and you can see that like he's hitting a lot of stereotypes in the characters. But at the time, it was enormously popular with the immigrant population. They saw themselves in this. And in the stereotypes they saw as exaggerated aspects of their own personality and culture, and they weren't bothered by it. Rudolph Dirks just did pretty much a variation of the same gag every week. The two kids, Hans and Fritz, the two most misbehaving kids who have ever existed, play a mean joke on one of their parents, and then they get caught and spanked at the end. And that happened every week. They never learned their lesson. They would always get caught and spanked. But a lot of the individual gags were funny, and Dirks played an important part in developing the visual language of comic strips. He did the little stars coming out of his butt to show pain where he's getting spanked. He did motion lines to give a kinetic sensibility to somebody who's actually moving. Sweat beads coming out of somebody's head when they're scared or they're excited. So he helped create a lot of that. And it was very innovative, and it's kind of interesting that that stuff never had to be explained. The first time somebody looked at a comic strip and saw the little stars coming out of the butt while he's being spanked, they just knew that meant it represented pain. So it's really quite amazing when you think about it, that he came up with this visual language that connected with people so obviously that everybody just instantly knew what it meant. Now, by 1907, this is a panel of a strip called Mutton Jeff, which was done by Bud Fisher. And these are a couple of actually very stupid racetrack touts. They are always gambling. And it was a strip that first actually appeared in the sports page on weekdays. But Fisher expanded it to like 3 or 4 panels a day, and it was eventually moved to a comics page, and it kind of started the idea of doing daily comics during the week. So now you have the daily black and white comics, 3 or 4 panels each from Monday through Saturday, and then on Sunday you had the big color comics. Mutton Jeff was also one of the first times there was a continuing story arc, where you had to get the paper every day to read what was happening in the next part of the story. It's something I'll go into a little bit more a little bit later. So it was an important and innovative strip. Now, for the first quarter century or so that comic strips existed, they were almost exclusively humor strips. They were there to set up a gag and make you laugh at the end. And almost every strip did that, and a lot of them did it extremely well. This is Polly and Her Pals by Cliff Sterrett, which first started running in 1912. It had this really neat Art Deco art style to it that still looks good today. And it kind of dealt with the idea of like being a modern parent in a world where now where dating exists between boys and girls, which at that time was a new thing. Until you had cars and electric lights so that you go out and go to the movies at night and all that, you didn't have dating the way we think of dating today. It was a brand new thing. And so here you had somebody who kind of stood in for every father in the world who was now in a panic because boys were taking their daughters out. So, and he became kind of the template for the goofy sitcom dad that you often see on television, who's like, loves his daughter and wants what's best for her, but always makes a mess of it in trying to look after her. He's kind of like the father of all those characters. Another important one was Happy Hooligan, done by Frederick Opper, who created the character in magazine cartoons and then was brought over to the comics because it was very popular. Happy Hooligan was a hobo who just bounced around the world getting into all sorts of shenanigans. And that's kind of, it's actually, that strip popularized the word hooligan to represent somebody who's a troublemaker, although Happy was never a troublemaker on purpose. He was just kind of stupid. So all of these are humor strips. There were some strips that were being more innovative. This is one, I think when you're talking about the first 25 years of comic strips, this is probably the best one, just in my subjective opinion. This is Little Nemo in Slumberland, done by an artist named Winsor McKay, who was also an innovator in animation. He did one of the first animated cartoons, and was a political cartoonist. He's one of those guys you read about everything he did, you can't figure out how he had time to do it all. But he did a Sunday-only strip called Little Nemo in Slumberland, which had a very simple premise. Little Nemo was a boy who would fall asleep, have a dream, and it would be an excuse for Winsor McKay to create all these images. And they had to them going from week to week, but because it was all just a little boy's dream, those storylines didn't have to follow any sort of story logic. He could take them anywhere he wanted and just come up with cool stuff to draw. And this strip shows more than anything else, I think, why this is considered a golden age of comic strips. Because back then, almost every comic strip got its own page. And the newspaper pages were actually a little bit bigger than they are nowadays. So you look at a modern Sunday page, you've got anywhere from 3 to 5 comic strips on each page. And they all have to be done with standard panel sizes because the editor of any one individual newspaper has to be able to cut it up and rearrange it to fit it in his paper. So the artists are restricted in what they can do. When artists had a full page all to themselves, they could just go to town with their artwork. They had the freedom to create, and they did absolutely wonderful things. So for instance, here in this dream, Nemo's bed starts walking, and the legs get longer and longer and longer, and you see how the panels, the vertical panels got longer and longer and longer as his bed grew higher.
Where was McKay from?
I'm sorry?
Where was McKay from?
He was from the US, and I do not remember where he was born.
Okay.
I think he was from the Northeast, but I could very easily be wrong about that.
Reasonable guess, anyway.
Yeah, okay. So, but, you know, we see this one. He's having a dream that he's in Slumberland, watching a parade, and McKay can just let his imagination run wild and draw all those weird stuff. Another panel example of what he could do with panel design, because he had a full page. See how it's horizontal when little Nemo and the princess are fired out of the cannon, and when their cannonball becomes a balloon, the images become vertical. He thought a lot about panel design and how the synergy of the whole thing worked to make the image look as cool as possible. So it's really a wonderful strip. It's been reprinted in these big folio editions that are just beautiful to look at. So it is worth finding and looking up. Now in 1918, the strip Gasoline Alley started. It was at first set in a garage where mechanics worked, because 1918, we're just getting to a time where people commonly own a car. So something set in a garage was at that time an innovative, original place to set it. But the interesting thing about this is one of the few strips where everybody aged in real time. So the characters got, a year of the strips went by, the characters were all a year older. The main character is Walt, the guy in red there. And a few years in, somebody left a baby on his doorstep, and he adopted it. And he named the baby Skeezix, which I think is the best baby name at all. I do not know why babies are not named Skeezix nowadays. And as time went by, Skeezix aged normally. He went off to fight in World War II. He got married and had a kid. His kids grew up and had kids. Eventually, the strip still runs today. It's on its 3rd or 4th artist, obviously. But eventually, around the 90s, they stopped aging the kids. They actually had to have several of the original ones die kind of off screen because they were getting to be where they'd be over 100 years old. So they just eventually stopped aging them so they didn't have to kill poor Walt off. But for really close to like 70 years, you just saw each generation of that family grow up as you followed the comic strip. And the artist, King, was another great one. I love this. You see how the page has this whole is just one shot of the house, and the kids are moving around it from panel to panel. It's just a cool image. It's just fun to look at. So the comic strip page back then, you got literally 16 pages of beautiful poster art every time you bought a Sunday paper. Now, in 1924, an artist named Roy Crane started doing what was at first another humor strip. It was called Washtubs. The main character was a dumpy little guy named Washington Tubbs III, who thought he was a big ladies' man, and a lot of the gags were based on that. But Crane got bored with coming up with a gag every day. So about 6 months into the strip, he started doing a continuing story arc where Wash went off to the South Seas on a treasure hunt. And instead of ending at a gag every week, it would end with a cliffhanger with Washtubs in danger. And the strip never lost its humor. It always had a good sense of humor. It always had kind of this cartoony look to it. But it became the first adventure strip. And it was a wonderful adventure strip that told really good stories. Washtubs, he doesn't look the part, but he eventually became basically a mercenary soldier, going around the world getting into dangers. Crane could do just great fight scenes. And because he had that cartoony look to it, he could do actually these really violent fight scenes that never seem violent because of that just cartoony feel to it. So you would have people beating the heck out of each other. You would have sometimes pretty high body counts, but the bodies would be lying there with a little X over their eyes, and it would just seem like good, clean fun, no matter how many people actually got killed. So it worked beautifully as just a fun adventure strip. After a few years, Crane realized that Washtubs just wasn't big and tough enough to carry an adventure strip by himself. So he had to meet a guy called Captain Easy, who was a professional soldier of fortune, and they became partners and started working together. So you had Captain Easy to do the heavy fighting. Well, Wash was certainly brave enough, but he was just a little guy, and he was never trained to fight, and he'd get captured or beaten up an awful lot. So you needed somebody who was better in a fight than most of the bad guys. And Easy became a very popular character in his own right. And what we have here is a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday strip that shows how comic strips sold newspapers by just drawing you into the story and forcing you to keep buying it to keep following the story. See, Wash and Captain Easy are helping a South American country try and overthrow a dictatorship. And they're on a little ship that's getting boarded by the enemy soldiers. So on Monday, you see Captain Easy set up a defense on the boat and start firing a machine gun at the attacking soldiers. Then on Tuesday, we move to the engine room, Tuesday and Wednesday, where Washtubs has to defend the engine room against the bad guys and does so successfully. But the main fight on top of the ship's still going on, right? So that means you have to buy the newspaper on Thursday to find out what's going to happen next. And on Thursday, you see the fight continues. Lots of people are getting killed. Captain Easy runs out of ammo or his gun jams one or the other. So on Friday, he gets out a cannon and he just starts blowing everything up. And on Saturday, the whole ship blows up. So who's alive? Who's dead? What's going to happen next? You got to buy the newspaper on Monday to find out. So these sorts of cliffhangers, which became very common, especially after Captain Easy ushered in other adventure strips, was a big selling point for newspapers. People often bought newspapers specifically based on what comic strips they carried.
People probably subscribe back then, especially in big cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
They subscribe then.
Yeah, you could subscribe. Now, right after World War II started, Roy Crane gave up Captain Easy. He wanted to get a strip where he had more of an ownership stake in it because he didn't actually own Captain Easy. It was owned by the syndicate that distributed it to the various newspapers. So he left that to another artist. It continued with other artists until the early 70s, actually. And he started doing a strip called Buzz Sawyer. And this was World War II. And his artwork had matured a little. He still was really good at using light and shadows for a great effect and drawing things very effectively. But the main character was a dive bomber pilot in the Navy. And you did war stories, which stressed things like duty and responsibility and fighting for your country and all of that. Buzz was supposed to be a great tough fighter. He actually got shot down a lot so that Crane could throw him onto isolated islands where he would have to fight the Japanese in other ways. But
is that where Kennedy got the theme for profiles and courage from that particular strip?
Not that I know of. That's actually a good question because it's likely he was aware of it. It was a popular strip, but I don't know.
I have another question later, but
okay.
Because I remember Alice, I think Alice.
Okay. Well, anyway, we're talking about adventure heroes in the comic strips. And here's like one of the most kick-butt adventure heroes in the comic strips of all time. And I'm actually perfectly serious. The Mickey Mouse cartoons that were being produced and shown in theaters in front of movies were so popular in the early 30s that people were going to the movies specifically because there was a Mickey Mouse cartoon. They weren't worried about what the main feature was. They wanted to see the Mickey Mouse cartoon. A few years later, the Donald Duck cartoons were equally kind of supplanted Mickey in popularity and did the same thing. So, you know, Walt Disney always approved of merchandising and spreading out. So an artist named Floyd Godfredson started doing a Mickey Mouse comic strip. And the comic strips turned Mickey into an action hero. It was still a funny animal strip, and there was a lot of humor to it, and Godfredson was great at humor. But there was also a sense of real danger and real adventure to the things that Mickey did. I mean, here he's getting into a fight with some kidnappers. And because he's small, he has to outthink them. You know, when they're swirling him around, he grabs that beehive and throws them into one of their faces. His friends also helped him out a lot. That is Horace Horsecollar, who was his sidekick before Goofy was created, and Horace's girlfriend, Clarabelle Clow, who's going after the bad guys with an axe. So she was pretty cool herself. So the story is obviously, I mean, you can see even from looking at these that there was a lot of humor. A lot of kind of confusion in the status of the characters, because there was one story arc set in the West where they were being cowboys. So Horace Horsecollar, an anthropomorphic horse, was riding a regular horse. And you just kind of read that and wonder, how the heck does this universe work? What's the
yin and the
But Mickey had some great adventures. By the late 30s, you know, he was being asked by the government to work to help catch these sky pirates who were using a Zeppelin to capture mail planes and rob them. So, and once again, you have this absolutely wonderful artwork. And here we have another kind of combined humor adventure strip. That's what Popeye looked like when we first met him. This was in a strip called Thimble Theater, which when Popeye, by an artist named E.C. Segar, it had started in 1919, and the main character was Olive Oil and her family, her brother Castor Oil, and her boyfriend Ham Gravy, right? So the strip goes on about them for literally 10 years. And then Segar, the artist, wanted to do a story arc where they had to go on a sea voyage. So he introduced Popeye as this one-time character to be there for that one story arc, right? And Popeye was so enormously popular that he stayed in the strip and became the star. And poor Olive Oil's first boyfriend, Ham Gravy, just kind of faded into pop culture obscurity, never to be seen again. Castor Oil, her brother, would occasionally pop up in a story, but he kind of disappeared too. So it was Popeye and Olive and the other characters he introduced, like Wimpy. And it was another wonderful, just completely over-the-top strip. The idea that Popeye has to eat spinach to be super strong came from the cartoons of the 30s, which were actually wonderful cartoons. But that was original. In the strip, he was just naturally tough. So here he's shot 16 times, and he doesn't even feel it because he's just that tough. So they had these story arcs that followed an actual real adventure story, but it was full of this over-the-top humor. And just a kind of bizarre combination that few artists who have done Popeye after that have done as successfully as Segar did. Another popular early strip was Barney Google, which was created by an artist named Billy DeBeck in 1919. Barney was kind of a little gambler racetrack guy, and the strip was just gags based on his always failing effort to hit the big time and make a lot of money gambling. But in 1922, he acquired a racehorse named Sparkplug, and there was a big, long story arc of him getting Sparkplug ready for a big race that actually was making headlines around the country. The strip would run, and then there would be front page news about what had happened in the strip. It really caught the public imagination. There were several songs, Barney Google with the googly eyes, and another one about Sparkplug. So it was enormously popular. I'm not even sure why. It's a perfectly good story, but for whatever reason, it just caught people's imaginations. Then in 1934, there was a storyline where Barney traveled to meet his hillbilly country, a cousin in the mountains, Snuffy Smith. And Snuffy was so popular that, like Popeye and Thimble Theater, he took over the strip. And so when I was reading this as a kid, I always wondered why it was called Snuffy Smith and Barney Google, because there was nobody named Barney Google in the strip. He disappeared, except for occasional, every few years, he'd pop up for a visit. So that, along with Popeye, are two examples of a character being so popular with the reading public that he supplants the original protagonist. Another bizarre strip was Alleyoop, done by an artist named V.T. Hamlin, starting in 1932. At first, it was in a vague way, kind of a precursor to the Flintstones. It was cavemen having situation comedy type adventures. But after a couple of years, they did a time travel story where a 20th century scientist brought Alleyoop and his girlfriend into the 20th century. And from then, it became another combination of humor and adventure where Alleyoop would be traveling around. Here he's at the Battle of Troy, hitting the bad guy with the hilt of his sword because he doesn't understand how swords work. Having adventures, no matter where he went, everybody spoke English. He came forward into the 20th century instantly, and that just worked in this strip. It didn't have to be realistic. So that is like Popeye in that it's a bizarre, unique combination of humor, absurdist humor, and adventure, and it works on both levels. By the early 30s, you had science fiction. Actually, I don't have a sample of it, but in the 20s, you had a character named Buck Rogers, who was originally in a pulp novel, became a comic strip, and was very popular. But the one that was really good was Alex Raymond in 1934 doing Flash Gordon. And Flash was an Earthman along with his girlfriend and his mad scientist friend crash on the planet Mongo, where basically everything tries to kill you all the time. And he has a series of adventures there. And we have another example of how an artist could use having the whole page to just do a cool image. So here he just does these hawk people swooping down on the army that Flash is currently leading. And that just looks awesome. It only advances the story a little tiny bit, but it just looks so cool you don't care. And that was something else that could be done because Alex Raymond knew he had the whole page to work with. And he could just do these epically cool images whenever he wanted to, and he was good at it. His girlfriend, Dale Arden, is very much in the tradition of the girlfriends of heroes, where she could not go to her room to change clothes without getting kidnapped by a villain. So she got kidnapped all the time, but then she's in good company, because if you ever become the girlfriend of a hero, you're going to get kidnapped on a regular basis. It's like your job description from that point on.
Busy lady.
Now, Tarzan was created in the pulp magazines in 1912 by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Burroughs was an early innovator of merchandising. Tarzan was enormously popular, so he would sell movie rights. He would sell comics. He has Tarzan comic strip that ran just on Sundays. He was very unhappy with the first artist who was doing it, and he pressured the syndicate, the comic book syndicate that was doing it, to change artists. And they contacted a guy named Hal Foster, who was an advertising art guy, and who had actually done a comic strip adaptation of the first Tarzan novel a few years before, but he did it just for the money. He didn't want to do comics. He was no interested in it. He was good at advertising art. He liked doing it. That's what he wanted to do. But they talked him into doing Tarzan, and he did a really good job. And as he started doing comic strip stories, he started to get into it, and he started to think about the possibilities of telling really in-depth stories in a Sunday comic book. But he couldn't really do a lot with Tarzan. Tarzan's a great character, but he's Tarzan. There's never going to be any character change or growth in him. He's already who he is. And that's appropriate for Tarzan. But he wanted to do more than that. So he passed Tarzan off to another artist, and he created the character of Prince Valiant. And this is set in the days of, this was started in 1937. It's set in the days of King Arthur, so it's set in kind of that mythical time right after the Romans had left Britain, where they didn't in real life, but you had castles and plate armor and all of that. So he did research, and he knew he put a lot of realism into it, but he also just went with the myth of the Round Table and medieval knights existing a few hundred years before they did in real life. And what he did with Prince Valiant is just create a great character who had all sorts of just cool adventures over the years, but he also did it in a way that showed character growth and real characterization. Because when the strip first starts, Prince Valiant's like 15 years old, and his dad is a king living in exile, and Valiant just wants to be a hero. He wants to be a knight, but he's just a teenager without any real training yet, so he has no idea what he's doing. But he's brave, and he sticks with it, and eventually he becomes the squire of Sir Gawain, one of the Knights of the Round Table. And the story stresses the importance of a young man having to have an older person who knows more than his as a mentor and a teacher. And gradually, in a very believable way, he grows both in skill and in character until by the time he's an adult, he's like one of the best knights of the Round Table. And you believe that because it got there in a way that makes sense from a human point of view. He had to go through training. First girl he fell in love with died tragically, so he had to go through heartache. He had to make mistakes. He had to do all the things that people do in real life in order to get good at what he was doing. And it's beautifully done. Foster is arguably the best illustrator who ever worked in comic strips. Every panel he ever drew is just beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful to look at. But he was also a wonderful writer who understood humans, who understood people, and he was a great storyteller who just put together stories that followed their own logic, made sense, and left you fully satisfied at the end of any story arc. That being said, it was an adventure story, so he wasn't always worried about being completely realistic. When Val met Aleta, the girl he would eventually marry, because of a misunderstanding, he thought she was a witch and had murdered these sailors he'd been hanging out with. So he takes her in chains and is carrying around the country telling everybody, witch, witch, witch. And they fall in love over, as he gradually realizes she's not a murderer, and they eventually fall in love, which is just not a good way to start a relationship, is to haul your girlfriend around in chains, accusing her of murder and witchcraft. That generally doesn't work in real life. But it's a wonderful story in its own right. And they fall in love, they kiss, but now she's the girlfriend of a hero. So what happens in the very next panel after that is she gets kidnapped. Yeah. And what follows is just this absolutely wonderful story where the bad guys have left Val knocked out on the side of the road without any weapons. He's following them on foot. The bad guy keeps sending back people to kill him. Val keeps killing those guys, getting their weapons and their horses and all. The bad guy, he's like this evil king. He finally gets to his castle. He figures he's safe. But Val raises an army, besieges the castle, figures out a way to get his soldiers inside the walls one night. And so while his soldiers are looting and burning and pillaging, he's off in a corner making googly eyes at his girlfriend. So, yes?
How large are the original illustrations? When did they start compressing for newspaper?
The original illustrations are something like 24 by 36. They're big. Yeah. The original. And at that time, the Sunday pages were probably 20 or 30% bigger than they are now. So they only had, when the printing process only had to shrink them down a little bit. So that's why you could put a lot of detail and you knew it, which after it was colored and printed, you knew those details would still be there.
But at what point were they able to shrink the images down to?
Oh, that's a good question. That's part of the printing process, the technical part of it. And I'm afraid I'm just not as good, I'm not that knowledgeable at that process of it.
I'd like to add something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of new here, but I've been here a couple of years, but I'm 51. I've been in the newspaper business since I was 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the past marketing director of the Washington Times and Gannett Company and Thompson out of Toronto. One of the things that I think might help you answer the question that the gentleman asked is that there was exactly, the illustrations were exactly that size.
Okay.
But as what happened is between somewhere about the 50, the 60, the 70, newspapers would buy a roll of newsprint, 2 tons, and it was still on rotogravure printing. Okay. And they would print. It was already printed, so Quad Graphics out of Minneapolis or whatever, and they would use the comic page that was front and back to put the inserts for the newspaper in.
Yeah.
So we weren't paying the individual artists anything. We went through Metro Services out of Kansas City, which has a unique dichotomy because that's where Walt Disney is, and that's where Metro Services is that now has the rights to 90% of all the comics. Yeah. And you just pay an annual fee like a syndication to get the comics. Yeah. It used to be that you paid an annual fee for each individual strip.
Yeah, but you had comic syndicates by the 30s. That was the common way to do it.
Right. So that whole middle ground thing, and interestingly enough, being in marketing and advertising research in the newspaper industry, I found that when you do a customer survey, one of the first 5 questions that that she put in the front of the survey is something about comics, and it always scores better than most about anything.
People still like comics.
Yeah, oh, well, absolutely. Because if you look, for example, even at the, well, I'm going to get into that.
Let's keep
I'm gonna keep.
Keep going. We're running out of time, and
Yeah.
we'll finish this, and we can have dialogue afterwards. That'll be great.
Okay. The Phantom was one of the often called the first costume superhero. He was created in the comic strips by Lee Falk. He had a great origin. His ancestor was the only survivor of a ship wiped out by pirates, who swears to fight piracy and evil forever. He became the Phantom. He had like a secret cave with a lot of treasure in Africa. And when he got killed, his son took over, but nobody except this one tribe that were his friends knew that. They thought it was the same guy. So he's called the Ghost Who Walks. They think he can't be killed and he lives forever because it's always the same, it looks like the same guy in this purple costume. And it's a great origin, it has a lot of atmosphere to it. The Phantom who was current when the comic book stripped up, like the 21st picked up, like the 21st Phantom, met Diane Palmer, who he would eventually marry, who actually might hold the record for getting kidnapped more than anybody else. I do not know how the two ever actually had time for an actual romance because he's always rescuing her. But that was just another great strip. Little Orphan Annie, created by Harold Gray in 1924. Gray was extremely conservative. He was, I think, fairly intelligent about it, but he wore his politics on his sleeves in there. He hated Roosevelt. But Little Orphan Annie was little and an orphan. And the theme of the strip was, be charitable to people in real need, but the best thing to do is give them an opportunity to work and earn their own living. And the strip was very big on that. She eventually met Daddy Warbucks, richest guy in the world, and it wasn't uncommon to do a story arc where he would lose all his money. One story arc, he lost all his money and went blind, but would start a new business from scratch and then be rich again within a few months because he was just using his own brains, his own intelligence. And that was Gray's thing. It was just like, just teach people to work and earn their own way. That's the best thing for them. The police procedural came to comic books in 1931 with Dick Tracy, who became a cop in the first story arc when his future father-in-law was murdered, and he walked in the police department and said, "Can I be a detective?" And they said, "Sure," and gave him a badge. But, yeah.
He was a truck driver, right?
I'm sorry?
He was originally a truck driver.
I think he was something like that, yeah. So, but he proved to be the best cop ever. The actual story showed usually reasonable police procedures. Fingerprints, following clues intelligently, questioning witnesses, and all that. The villains were always these hideous-looking guys. Gould's art style was very expressionistic. It wasn't realistic. It was meant to generate emotion. And so he used hideous-looking bad guys to represent the hideousness of their moral character. So he had Pruneface, who was a Nazi spy. The Brow there was also a Nazi spy. Flat Top was a kidnapper and bank robber. The Mole ran a car theft ring and all of that. He did these wonderful storylines. You read reprints of them where you're not waiting a day. You realize that Gould used wild coincidence an awful lot to move the story around. But you didn't notice that as much when you were just reading one strip a day in the 30s and 40s. And it was just a very exciting strip to read. I said it was realistic, but one thing that happened to Dick Tracy that I don't think happens to most cops in real life, so he would often get kidnapped and put in a death trap. So this is one of my favorite death traps ever. I don't know what it says about me that I have a favorite death trap, but the refrigerator is being held out by 2 blocks of ice, and it's got that spike to it. So as the ice melts, the spike comes closer and closer and closer. So that lasts for days while you're just, how is he going to get out of this? So another thing that Gould did was he was not afraid to create sympathetic characters, get you to like them a lot, and then very abruptly kill them off. So you knew that Dick Tracy was never going to die because he's the title character. But you didn't know about anybody else, including long-term characters. This is like the Summer Sisters, April and May, were like kind of petty thieves, but when they ran into a Nazi spy, they tried to do the right thing and help the cops catch him. But then the bad guy runs them into the water, and you're reading a couple days of strips where you keep expecting somebody to show up and save them, but nobody does. They die, and he did that all the time. He's killing off people he liked all the time. So when Dick got married and had a baby in the early 50s, and his baby was kidnapped by like this psycho lady and left in the woods for wolves to eat, you honestly didn't know if the baby was going to live or not. So you had to buy the newspaper the next day, you know, because you knew if you were reading Dick Tracy for a long time, you knew that he wasn't afraid to kill his people off. So it was a great storytelling technique. It was also, Gould would have been the first one to admit it was a marketing technique too. So. My favorite adventure strip, Terry and the Pirates, was created by Milt Caniff in 1934. It was a little bit cartoony looking at first. The main character, Terry, is an orphan who's brought to China by Pat Ryan as guardian because Terry supposedly inherited a gold mine, which turns out to be being used by bandits, so they have to get into fight to the death there. So after that adventure ended, the gold mine blew up, so they're just bumming around Asia for years, doing whatever they can for a living, getting into adventures. Caniff was brilliant at choreographing great fight scenes, and he was also great at characterizations. He introduced characters in a realistic way with realistic personalities. You really believed that these could be real people, and you got to care about them. In the 40s, he used that also to kill off a very popular character that just made headlines the next day that, Raven Sherman's dead. How could he do that? So. He actually got called a murderer by the elevator boy when he went to work the next morning after he killed Dolphin. So he was really good at using light and shadows for dramatic effect. He just knew how to tell a story well. This is another strip where the characters did age normally. So by the time he got to World War II, Terry was old enough to join the Army Air Corps and become a fighter pilot. I'm going to go through this real quick. This is what a newspaper section looked like in the 1930s. So you get a full page there. You get, everything is either a full page or a half a page sometimes, so you could put an advertisement in. But all these strips are great. Sometimes a artist would do a Sunday page and then they do a smaller little strip on the bottom with a different character so that the editor of any one newspaper had the option of cutting that smaller strip out to put in a little ad. But they could do that without affecting the main strip. So you can see it's a combination of full page and half page stuff. Every page looks great. And that's only, I think, the second ad we've seen. So there wasn't a whole lot of advertisements. Another thing that artists often did was put in these little paper doll figures of their characters. That was actually very common with several artists. So that's what you got when you bought the newspaper in the 30s. Now, comic books came around in the 1920s. This is what is often considered the first comic, the funnies, the first comic, the actual comic book. And at first, they were mostly reprints of newspaper comic strips, but they sold enough to be worthwhile. They weren't a big thing in culture at first, but the publishers started creating original characters to appear in them. And so in 1938, when DC Comics did the first Superman comic, it was Action Comics #1, it was huge. Ironically, the artists who created him, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Siegel was the writer, Shuster was the artist, had trouble selling him, the character, anywhere. They created him as a newspaper strip, and everybody said, this is a dumb idea, it's too silly, no one will ever read it. They finally sold it to the Comics, who reformatted it to go on the comic book page, and it sold like literally 1 million copies. And he was instantly a pop culture phenomenon. There were Superman cartoons, there was a Superman novel in the 40s, there was a radio show that's still a lot of fun to listen to. He was an enormously popular character. And comic book publishers, soon comic books were more of a commercially viable thing in our culture. And because Superman was popular, every comic book company started creating superheroes right and left, just kind of throwing them at the wall to see which ones stuck and became popular. So DC, that also did Superman, did Batman, obviously another one of their successes. Wonder Woman, one of the first female superheroes who was successful. Other companies were creating stuff as well. Fawcett Comics did Captain Marvel, a little kid named Billy Batson who would yell the magic word Shazam, get hit by magic lightning, and turned into Captain Marvel, who was actually for several years more popular than Superman. The Captain Marvel stories are just wonderfully imaginative things. They're still fun to read today.
Battle after that too, right?
Yeah, here's one of my favorite villains. Captain Marvel fought Mr. Mind, a little alien worm about this big, who's also like a criminal genius. So, and this was one of the few times that they did a continuing story. It was a 24-part Captain Marvel story in the mid-40s where he fought what was called the Monster Society of Evil, where Mr. Mind was the main villain. And he was working with Nazis and Japanese and alien invaders and this really bizarre series of weird adventures. Like included like driving off a secret Nazi invasion of Scotland with a mammoth they had thought out of an iceberg, or sitting on top of a volcano to keep it from erupting and wondering how he was going to get out of this. At the end of the story, Mr. Mind's actually put on trial, and he's so evil even his own lawyer denounces him, and he ends up getting like strapped to an electric chair with little electrodes and getting executed. So, Marvel Comics in 1941, they were called Timely Comics at the time. They weren't Marvel yet. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon created Captain America. What's neat about him is that most pop culture outlets were kind of ignoring World War II because there was a lot of isolationist feelings in the country, and they just didn't want to deal with it. We didn't want to get in this war. They weren't dealing with it even in fiction. Timely Comics, this was 6 months before Pearl Harbor this came out. You could see him like cold cocking Hitler. So I've always been impressed by that they were one of the few pop culture outlets. There were a few others that just dealt with fascism before it was cool to deal with fascism and said, this is evil and we're going to have to do something about it eventually. And that's always impressed me. We're going to get to the 1950s because I'm actually going a little slower than I thought I would. So in the late 40s, for no particular reason whatsoever, kids got sick of superhero stories. And except for Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, there were no continuing successful superhero stories during the 50s. Comic books were bigger than ever, and popular comics could sell like 1 million copies. Nowadays, if a best-selling comic sells 30 to 40,000 copies, the publishers are ecstatic. Back then, a popular comic could literally sell 1 million copies. They were cheap, even considering inflation. At 10 cents a pop, they were impulse buys, which they're not today. So there's a lot of difference in the economics. But this is just a Superman from the 50s, one of the few still popular superhero comics, in part because there was the wonderful TV show with George Reeves was on, kept him popular. But also in the early 50s, a psychologist named Frederick Wertham wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he said comic books are responsible for juvenile delinquency and are like subtly pushing all these evil, immoral agendas. And that wasn't the only cause, but it was part of kind of an anti-comic book panic. There were actually hearings in front of Congress where publishers had to come and say, no, we're not evil, please don't pick on us, and all of that. A company called EC, which did actually, their war stories and their science fiction stories from that era are some of the best stuff ever done in comic books. They also did these horror stories, which a lot of people remember vividly today. I just personally think they're kind of overrated, but that's what got them into trouble. It's like you would show this to, the congressman would show this, and you could say, should kids be reading this? And if there had been a rational, intelligent discussion, that might have been a good point, but it was all done with kind of a panic. You're turning all our kids into maniacal criminals by publishing this. It just didn't treat what was a legitimate concern with any rationality or intelligence. EC decided just to close up shop, and they stopped doing color comics. They kept doing Mad Magazine, which was originally a comic, as a black and white magazine, so they could just avoid the whole it's not a comic book thing. Because most other companies got together and formed a comic code authority to prevent the government from coming in and telling them what they do. They started self-regulating. So they came up
with very strict rules about what they could and couldn't show. Some of the rules were reasonable if you're thinking that your audience is mostly children. Some were just dumb. Some were had no context to them. In the 70s, a Spider-Man story dealt with drug addiction, and they had to publish it without the Comic Code Authority because they were told you can't show drug addictions. Well, we're showing it as a bad thing. It's destroying this guy's life. It's a warning. It was a really good story, too. But they actually had to just ignore the Comic Code Authority to publish a story condemning the use of illegal drugs because you couldn't show drug addiction at all. So it was a combination of, arguably rational rules with just panicky rules. Yes?
Was there a relationship between this and the MPAA? Like did they get influence from it or anything?
I don't think so. I think this actually was a little before the MPAA started using G and R and all of that. So they were kind of the precursors. So it's a good question. I honestly don't know. It's possible the MPAA was using this as a model. So you still had good comics. There was one company did Classic Illustrated, which was these actually often quite good adaptations of classic novels. You had science fiction comics were very popular. And by the time you got to the early 60s, things had calmed down enough to where they could start doing horror stories again. This is a Ghost Stories, issue called Ghost Stories by Dell Comics that did actually one of the creepiest stories ever. It's like this hand comes out of the sewer and pursues you and just keeps getting longer and longer and you just can't get away from it no matter where you go. It's actually one of the best horror stories ever done. And it's not graphically violent or tasteless at all. It's just comes up with a fun theme and scares you with it. The World War II themed stories were very popular starting in the 50s through the 70s. And DC Comics in particular did really, really great stories with great, strong artwork. You could see why they were popular. You had built-in good guys and bad guys, and everybody reading it immediately understood the situation. You didn't have to explain what was going on. We're fighting the Nazis or the Japanese. Boom, start your story and you're done. They first did anthology stories. Eventually, they started creating characters to star in the war comics. This is Sergeant Rock, who fought in Europe. And on the right is one of my personal favorites from when I was a kid. The Haunted Tank is an American tank haunted by the ghost of a Civil War general who only the commander of the tank can see, and he would pop up and give cryptic advice that the tank commander would have to figure out in the nick of time to keep the Germans from blowing him up. Why the ghost didn't just say there's Germans hiding behind that bush, I don't know. But they were wonderful stories with great artwork. DC Comics, or Marvel Comics, I'm sorry, in the 60s got into World War II with Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. And Nick Fury was eventually moved into their contemporary superhero comics as a spy. So he fought as a soldier and then became a spy later on and became a major character in the DC superhero universe. He's Samuel Jackson in the current movies. He doesn't have the World War II history anymore, but he was originally a World War II veteran. And the comics would do bizarre combinations of things. World War II comics are popular. Dinosaurs are always popular. So let's do a series of stories where World War II soldiers keep running into dinosaurs on these isolated islands in the Pacific. These were stories that existed simply so you could show images like this. They had storylines to them, but just barely. They never had continuing characters. You didn't care who the characters were. You just wanted them to have to use hand grenades and bazookas to stop dinosaurs. That was all you cared about. It was just a wonderful series. Humor comics were very popular in the 40s and 50s. Archie started in 1941. He's so nearly 80 years later, he still has not decided on Veronica or Betty. And if he had any brains at all, he'd pick Betty, but what can you do? And Westerns were particularly popular. In the 50s, if you could create a Western comic book or TV show or movie, it was kind of like printing money. People could not get enough Westerns at that time. And The Lone Ranger, who was started on radio and went to TV in the late 40s, was one of the most popular ones. And he had just an absolutely wonderful comic strip that was so popular that Tonto and his horse Silver spun off into their own strips because people just could not get enough of these characters. So, and the Lone Ranger and other licensed characters were generally done by Dell Comics. That was their specialty, was to license out Disney characters, Warner Brother cartoon characters, the Lone Ranger. They would do adaptations of TV shows. They would do adaptations of movies. They had great writers and great artists working for them, so they did really strong stuff. They were the most popular comic book company in the 50s, and they were so popular they didn't even bother with the comics code. They actually advertised their comics as being family friendly and had their own standards, and they were bringing in so much money that nobody questioned them, because and they actually did do stuff that you could let your kids read. They never did anything that was adult only. They just did it really well. So they licensed the Disney stuff. Donald Duck in the 50s was an extremely popular comic book character. And an artist named, they did Westerns. District Attorney was based on a radio show, Raggedy Ann, so stories based on the dolls. They just went anywhere they wanted to come up with different comic book stories with different companies. And they did it really well, and were very popular. Yep, so I'm going to go through these quick because I'm about to go over time. So just more samples of the Westerns they did. The most popular character in the 1950s was Uncle Scrooge McDuck, Donald's super rich uncle. They just brought back the cartoon about him called DuckTales just recently. It came back in a new version on the Disney Channel. But an artist named Carl Barks, who was just one of the best storytellers who ever worked in comics, created him at first as a one-shot character to appear in a story where he could interact with Donald and Huey, Dewey, and Louie. He was so popular that eventually, pretty soon, he had his own comic book. And Barks had to create his character more in depth. You found out he was really rich. He had a giant money bin where he kept all his money in cash, and he went swimming in it because he was really, 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 really stingy. But you gradually learn that he earned all his money honestly. He would phrase it as saying, I was tougher than the toughies and smarter than the smarties, but he was always completely honest. And you gradually realize that he actually did care more about his family, although he would never admit it out loud, than he did about his money. And so he became a really, really cool character. And the stories he starred in were either trying to keep villains from robbing his money bin or going off on a treasure hunt to find something else valuable and bringing Donald with him and having all sorts of adventures there. Mickey had another popular strip that usually reprinted the comic strips from the 30s. Little Lulu was a very hilarious humor strip. An artist named Walt Kelly did animal comics for Dell. Did these fairy tale adaptations and created the character of Pogo that he would actually later spin off into a very popular comic strip. So Dell had wonderful artists working for them. This was a character named Rover, a dog, a fairly realistic story about a dog that I'm showing because these are being reprinted in a book that will hopefully come out this year that I got to write the introduction for. So this is completely self-serving that I'm showing these. So just more samples of Dell. I'm sorry, I'm going through these quicker because I underestimated how much time this song would take. So, and if I had more time, I would talk about some of the original characters that Dell, that later became Gold Key Comics, published. My favorite as a kid was Turok, two Indians, pre-Columbian Indians, get in a valley they can't find their way out of that's full of dinosaurs. And every issue is them fighting dinosaurs and trying to find their way out of the valley. It was Gold Key. This Dell, as I said, later became Gold Key Comics. They did an excellent Tarzan and the first comic book adaptation of Star Trek that actually ran longer than the original TV series did. So in the late 50s, superheroes, for no particular reason whatsoever, made a huge comeback. DC Comics started creating new versions of some of their old superheroes, which were very, very popular. Marvel Comics joined the bandwagon by creating Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. The two companies had completely different styles in how they told the stories, and both were good. I have to kind of skip through that too, sorry. Other companies that were around in the 60s, while the superheroes were big again, were Harvey Comics that did mostly humor strips about Casper and other characters like that. That's the most adorable cover ever done, by the way. And a company called Charlton, which published other things and did comic books because it was actually cheaper to spend a day printing comic books than to turn their printing presses off for a day and turning them on again. So they were all over the place in quality because the publishers didn't actually care what was in the comics. And so you had really brilliant stuff instead of some great superheroes, including some great superhero stuff with characters that were later bought by DC Comics, so they're still around today. Some great war stories and westerns, and also a lot of stories that were just bad. So they were all over the place in quality. This is like 70s Batman stuff, written by Danny O'Neill with art by an artist named Neil Adams. This is the best time for Batman because he was presented as a skilled detective as well as a great escape artist and martial artist and all of that. There was a real balance to the character that nobody ever really got right after that. In comic strips, starting in World War II, you had paper shortages. Comics got smaller. Artists were started requiring to do standard panel sizes, so Sunday strips became just infinitely less cool than they used to be. But there were some artists who could work within that framework and still do brilliant things. Probably the best is Charles Schultz's Peanuts. Everybody loves Charlie Brown because he represents the insecurity and the conviction that we're going to fail no matter what that we all feel sometimes. And probably the last great comic strip was Calvin and Hobbes, which ran in the 80s and 90s, about the most misbehaving kid in the world, might even beat the Katzenjammer kids out on that. And his stuffed tagger, who either comes to life when nobody else is around, or Calvin just imagines he comes to life when nobody's around. And the artist was very careful never to give an answer to that. And he was also the last artist with enough pull, because he was so popular, to force newspapers to give him half a page so that he could do fun with panel design and just do these awesome Sunday strips. So, sorry I went a little long there. This is my shameless self-promotion page. These are my books. And my blog is called Comics, Old Time Radio, and Other Cool Stuff. So, any questions or comments? Well done. Thank you. I appreciate it.